to make it possible for Jackie Robinson to enter Major League Baseball. And to point out that although Jackie Robinson is often called the first Black person in Major League Baseball, that's not really true, as probably many of you know if you're baseball fans and fans of baseball history. But there's a whole hidden history of the social movement, of civil rights groups, labor unions, of the Black newspapers, particularly the Pittsburgh Courier, but others, of ball players and sports writers and radical politicians who paved the way for Jackie Robinson. And the rebels in baseball are as Sean mentioned, are the subject of the two books that Robert Elias and I published earlier this year, Baseball Rebels and Major League Rebels. Baseball Rebels is about the battle over race and gender and homophobia in baseball going back to the 1800s. And Major League Rebels is the battle of ball players fighting the corporate robber barons that owned and ran baseball teams going back to the 1800s, and the efforts to unionize the players, but also the role that baseball has played in promoting American empire and colonialism, particularly in Latin America and Central America, but also in Asia, and the battle to extricate baseball from those trends. So that's the research that I did that helped lead me to this story. Now, the story of baseball's integration in 1947 is often described as the tale of two great people. And they were great people. Jackie Robinson, a remarkable athlete, four-sport athlete at UCLA, where baseball was his least favorite and accomplished sport, who had enormous amount of emotional resilience to withstand the racism that he had to face, and the great strategist and political operative, Branch Rickey, who maneuvered the politics of Major League Baseball to make it possible for Jackie Robinson to enter the game. And that's partly true. Both of them are great men. Both of them deserve a lot of credit. But there's a whole hidden history behind that story, which very few people know, and which the major movies about baseball and Jackie Robinson, like the Jackie Robinson story in 1950 or 42, the 2014 film about Jackie Robinson's rookie year, they completely ignore this hidden behind-the-scenes history, and that's what I've tried to excavate and report on in the book and also in this talk. Excuse me. So, very briefly, Black people have always played baseball ever since the game was invented before the Civil War, and baseball has often been used as part of the larger struggle over civil rights and racism in America. And one of the key characters in this story is a guy named Octavius Catto, who was a remarkable human being before and during this and after the Civil War. He was one of the key abolitionists. He was friendly with Frederick Douglass. He was a real Renaissance man who pioneered Black education in Philadelphia, who integrated Philadelphia's streetcars a century before Rosa Parks. He helped integrate the U.S. military. He led the city's civic and intellectual life in many ways. He promoted civil rights and voting rights for African Americans in Philadelphia and around the country. And he died as a martyr. You see the painting of him being murdered when he went to vote and tried to get other Black people to vote during the mayor's race in Philadelphia in 1871. But for these purposes, Catto was the founder, the captain, and the star shortstop of the Black Pythian Baseball Club, which became a major vehicle for his work in civil rights. And he formed this team. They were an enormously great athletic team, but of course, during segregation, he wasn't allowed to play in the same leagues and against the same teams that were all white. And that became his obsession and his passion. And so after he founded that team in 1866, he began to insist that if the white leagues, the National Association of Baseball Players, which rejected his application to allow the Pythians to be in the league, even though they accepted the applications of 265 white teams, if they wouldn't let him play in the league, the least that he could do was to try to get the Pythians to play against all white teams, even if it wasn't in the league. And he achieved that. And in 1869, the Pythians defeated a white team called the City Item Club. And it was a form of equality at the time. Although there was a lot of controversy of it, it reminded people that African Americans were just as good as athletes and in other ways as their white counterparts. And it was part of the ongoing struggle for civil rights and integration in America. And Cato, I think, should be in the Hall of Fame. Those of you that are familiar with the history of Black baseball know that Moses Fleetwood Walker was a catcher and first Black ball player in the major leagues in the 1880s, before the Jim Crow system inhabited baseball. When he retired, when he was forced out of baseball because of Jim Crow, he became a Black nationalist leader, an inventor of film and artillery equipment. He owned an opera house. He's quite a remarkable, accomplished person. And Bud Fowler, who you can see on the right in the middle of the photo, was the first Black player in 1872 to play. He didn't play in the majors, but he did play in semi-pro teams and against white teams and with white teammates. And as you know, he was elected to the Hall of Fame last year. But of course, the enemy of all this is Cap Anson, the manager and star player of the Chicago White Stockings, who in the 1880s said he and his team would refuse to take the field if Walker or any other Black player was playing on the opposite team. And he had enough power, enough influence that he was able to instigate kind of an informal rule of against Black players playing in the professional major, what we would now call the major leagues. I don't believe in necessarily in tearing down monuments and canceling things, but if the Hall of Fame was ever to remove a plaque from the wall, it probably would be Cap Anson. The founder of the Negro Leagues, Rube Foster, was an enormously great pitcher. The Negro Leagues were part of a much bigger movement in America during Jim Crow, which was the creation of alternative parallel institutions in the Black community because of segregation. So there were Black high schools, Black colleges, Black hospitals, Black social clubs, Black civil rights organizations, and Black sports leagues, including the Negro Leagues. And Foster was not only a star pitcher, but he was the founding member of an executive of the Negro Leagues. And he deserves a lot of credit for creating this alternative institution, which allowed Josh Gibson and many other great ball players, Black ball players, to make a living and become celebrities in their community. There's a little-known story of a baseball rebel named Frank Sykes that I always like to talk about. Frank Sykes was a pitcher for 5 Black teams in the Negro Leagues between 1913 and 1926. He graduated from what is now Morehouse College, and then later went to dental school at Howard University, and so he's known as Doc Sykes to people. And he grew up in a small town in Alabama called Decatur. And in 1931, one of the most outrageous racial injustices in American history took place, where 9 African-American teenagers in a little town called Scottsboro, Alabama, were arrested for allegedly raping these two white women who accused these young men of raping them. It was false, but given the criminal justice system at the time, they were all found guilty by an all-white jury. And they all went to prison except for one of them, who was 16 at the time. And it took appeals for another 6 years before some of them were exonerated, but they'd all but one went to prison. But one of the most important and little-known aspects of that was that Doc Sykes, who lived in Decatur where they had moved the trial, testified as a witness that there were Black people that should serve on the jury. And he actually named some of the reasonably well-educated and middle-class working people who deserved to be on that jury. It was an amazingly courageous thing to do at a time when there was no such thing as racial justice in the South. And his house was burned down. He got death threats. He couldn't practice his dental practice anymore because of the fear. And so he eventually moved to Baltimore, where he reopened his dental practice. But he also, in the Negro Leagues, helped to organize his fellow players to get better pay and working conditions. And Frank Sykes' story should be better known. So these are names, like many, that are familiar to all of you that are well-read in Black American history and baseball history. Of course, Josh Gibson and Satchel Paige and Oscar Charleston. We all know about them, but at the time they were playing, very few white Americans heard of these people or any of the other players. Some of them they all went barnstorming and played white teams, but for the most part, the white newspapers in America ignored the Negro Leagues and ignored their star players. And so if you read the Black newspapers, the Chicago Defender, the Pittsburgh Courier, the Amsterdam News, the Baltimore Afro-American, lots of others, you knew who these people were, you admired them. But if you were white, the white papers basically ignored them. And that was partly due to this guy, Kennesaw Mountain Landis, the first commissioner of baseball, who was appointed commissioner by the owners after the 1919 Black Sox scandals. And he ran baseball with an iron fist. He was a racist and a segregationist, and he refused any efforts to integrate Major League Baseball. And he always claimed that there was no official rule against Black players, which is partly true, but not entirely true. It was an informal gentleman's agreement, but he was the guy more than anyone else that held up the integration of baseball. Not that the owners were all ready and willing to do it, but he was the iron fist. But there were some exceptions to the blackout of Black players in white newspapers, and two of them were among the most popular sports columnists in America, Hayward Broun and Jimmy Powers. Hayward Broun was a syndicated columnist beginning in the 1930s, widely read in newspapers all over the country in his column. And Jimmy Powers, the lead sports columnist for the New York Daily News, which was the largest newspaper in terms of circulation in the country. And in February 1933, when Jackie Robinson was 14 years old, Hayward Broun gave a talk at the annual dinner of the New York Baseball Writers Association, which was all white at the time. And he said that if Black athletes were good enough to represent the United States in the Olympics, and if Joe Louis was good enough to be a champion boxer, and he said, quote, "It seems a little silly that Black people cannot," he didn't say Black people, he said colored people, that cannot participate in a game between the Chicago White Sox and the St. Louis Browns. And he said, "Why in the name of fair play and gate receipts should professional baseball be so exclusive?" And then he wrote up his remarks the next day in this column, which was syndicated in hundreds of newspapers. This is the one from the Pittsburgh Press. So he was very outspoken. He was a socialist and a radical, and he believed in racial integration. This is a column the same week by Jimmy Powers, who also called for the integration of baseball. His column is called "Colored Baseball Players Okay," and he made the same point that Hayward Brown made. So even when Jackie Robinson was in middle school and here in Pasadena, California, people were fighting for racial integration of baseball, and long before Branch Rickey. The key players in the movement for integrating baseball, however, were the black newspapers and the labor unions. And the most important ones in the black press were Chester Washington, the sports editor of the Pittsburgh Courier, and Wendell Smith, who was a reporter, but later became the sports editor of the Pittsburgh Courier. Now, the Pittsburgh Courier was published in Pittsburgh, but it circulated all over the country. And the way that happened is that they would sneak the paper onto the trains through the black porters, who were organized through the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters by A. Philip Randolph, the great organizer. And they would basically spread the Pittsburgh Courier to all these little towns throughout the South, doing it illegally, or at least quietly. So on the left in the center is Chester Washington, on the right is Wendell Smith. If you watch the movie 42 about Jackie Robinson's rookie year, all you'd know about Wendell Smith was that he was Jackie Robinson's driver and the ghostwriter for his newspaper column and his friend. And so you don't get any sense from that film that Wendell Smith was a lot more than that. He was an organizer, an activist, and a movement player in this crusade to integrate baseball. Some of the others, there were many, but some of the other prominent black sports writers at the time that used their columns and their newspapers to fight for integration were Joe Bostic of the People's Voice, a paper in Harlem, Sam Lacey from the Baltimore African-American, and Fay Young, a sports writer for the Chicago Defender. And what they would do in their columns and in their news stories was to promote the idea that black baseball players were as good as white players and should be in the major leagues, because a lot of people, including Kenneth Orlandis, would say that there aren't enough good black ball players in the major leagues, and to also point out that white players in the majors were willing to accept black teammates, that it wasn't the white players who were the obstacle to integrating Major League Baseball. And then they would promote those ideas for years in the black newspapers. And here's an example where in 1938, Chester Washington interviewed players on the Pittsburgh Pirates, and he interviewed the owner of the Pirates, a guy named William Benswanger, who told Washington, as he says in this article, that he thought that Josh Gibson and Satchel Paige were two of the greatest players he ever saw, and that if it's he says, I've seen lots of colored clubs play, and he thinks that they're just as good as white players. Now, he was being a bit of a hypocrite because we had the chance to do something about it. He didn't. But it was part of this crusade to remind black readers and white readers, of whom there were some of the black newspapers, that there wasn't this monolithic opposition to integrating Major League Baseball. And even at least one of these owners said that he agreed with it. Here's an article in the Pittsburgh Courier, 1939, again, 8 years before Jackie Robinson takes the field for the Dodgers, where he interviews the Chicago Cubs, including Gabby Hartnett. And he says that if Negro players were allowed to play, there'd be a mad scramble to get their talents onto the teams. And so again, this is part of this crusade, where they interviewed white players and white managers, and most of whom said that they thought there was nothing wrong. Now, I don't want to be, mythical about this. There were clearly white players, particularly in the South, that opposed integration of baseball. But it's still important to recognize that the effort of this movement was to get people to recognize that it wasn't all white players and managers who were opposed to it. So this is another article in the Pittsburgh Courier of 1939. The headline's hard to read on the top there. It says, "Are Negro ball players good enough to crash the majors?" Well, that was a question that they raised because lots of people, including sports writers, white sports writers, and owners, people like Ford Frick, the head of the National League, said they're not. And here he quotes Pie Traynor, the great Hall of Fame third baseman for the Pirates. He said that there's no need for a color ban in the big leagues. And you can see the photos of all the Pittsburgh Pirates on the bottom there, who all said that they rated Negro players as among the best players in baseball, and that they should be allowed to play in the majors. One of the few sports writers, white sports writers, who played an important role in this movement was Lester Rodney, who was a member of the Communist Party and convinced the Daily Worker, the Communist Party's newspaper, that they needed a sports page. And so they hired him to be their sports editor. And then they eventually had quite a few reporters who wrote up sports for the Daily Worker. And he saw, like the Communist Party in general, that he thought that racial integration in all of America, including baseball, was an important thing to fight for. And he did it in the pages of the newspaper and did the same thing that the black sports writers did. Wrote telegrams to owners saying you need to give tryouts to black players, interviewed white players and managers. He even interviewed Leo DeRocher, and Leo DeRocher said that he thought he'd hire a black player in a minute if his owners would allow them to do that. And so it was part of this ongoing struggle to persuade Major League Baseball and Landis that public opinion was on their side, and to break down the barriers that Landis and the other owners, beside Benswanger, had put up against integration. The Communist Party held parades, like this May Day parade in New York, where white and black veterans of World War I and labor union members called for admit Negroes to big league baseball. It was part of the End Jim Crow in baseball movement that the unions at the time helped to foster. In 1940, the labor unions and the Communist Party and civil rights groups demonstrated at the World's Fair in New York, in Queens, in New York, at the stadium there, picketing in front, calling for the integration of Major League Baseball. This was an article in the New York Amsterdam News. Interesting. I looked really hard to find news stories about this protest and this picket, and the only ones I could find were in the Daily Worker and in the black newspapers like the New York Amsterdam News, but no white paper, well, even in New York, the New York Times, the Daily News, reported on this. One of the things that the black press and the Communist Party newspaper, the Daily Worker, did was to quote white players about how great black players were, and to report that when black teams, Negro League teams or barnstorming teams of black players played against barnstorming teams of white players, that the black teams often won, right, more often than not. And so here's an article in the Pittsburgh Courier, 1942, about how Satchel Paige beat Dizzy Dean in an exhibition game, and then quoted Dean saying that Satchel Paige was the best pitcher he'd ever seen. World War II, when America entered World War II in December of 1941, excuse me, it helped to lift up the hypocrisy of black soldiers fighting overseas for freedom and against bigotry and Nazism, and then being segregated at home. And so the black press promoted an idea of the double V for victory, meaning victory overseas against fascism and victory at home against racism. And Chester Washington and others argued that that they should put a double V sign on all the uniforms in the Negro League teams. And they lifted that up, saying that if Uncle Sam is going to send Black Americans to fight against fascism, they should be treated as first-class citizens at home. And this is another article in the Chicago Defender saying that barring the Negro Leagues and the major leagues flouts the democratic ideals of war. That's an article by Fay Young, the Defender's sports editor. It also, World War II also gave more impetus and pressure on major league teams to at least give some kind of token tryouts to Black players, even if they weren't sincere about wanting them on the team. So during the war, Chicago White Sox held their spring training about 2 miles from where I am right now in Brookside Park in Pasadena, California. Here's a photo of their spring training. Under pressure, the White Sox gave a tryout to 2 young professional ball players, Jackie Robinson and Nate Moreland, who had both grew up and lived in Pasadena. Moreland had gone to college in a nearby college, and Jackie Robinson had gone to UCLA. By then, Jackie Robinson was playing professional football, and he came back, and he was after he was in, before he was in the Army, and they gave him a tryout. They gave both of these guys a tryout, and Jimmy Dykes, the manager of the White Sox, said that they were, particularly Robinson, was fantastic. He said that if Robinson was in the majors, he'd be worth $50,000, which was almost unheard of back then as a salary. And here's an article in the Courier, basically saying that the White Sox reject those 2 players. They were barred from continuing the tryout, even though they both did very well. There were also pickets in front of, in New York, in front of Ebbets Field, Yankee Stadium, the Polo Grounds, and even out here in California, the labor unions, the civil rights groups like the NAACP and the Communist Party, 3 groups that didn't always see eye to eye, did see eye to eye on integrating Major League Baseball. And they went to Wrigley Field, which was the field that the LA Angels, then a minor league team for the Chicago Cubs, played on, and they picketed. I could find no photos of that picket, but here's the newspaper story in the Pittsburgh Courier about that. And the unions kept harassing and petitioning and pressuring Landis and the owners. In 1942, they passed a resolution, the CIO, the Congress of Industrial Organizations, and the Maritime Workers Union sent a telegram and a petition to Judge Landis, to Commissioner Landis, asking for a meeting and saying that there should be integration. And the Packing House Union did the same thing. He says that banning Black players in the major leagues is an expression of Hitlerism that we're all seeking to destroy. And this is the Chicago Defender. All this time, Landis denied that there was a rule against Black players in the majors. And again, it was a gentleman's agreement. You couldn't find anything on paper, but it was as solid as a contract. The movement to integrate baseball got a big boost in June of 1942 when the Catholic Bishop of Chicago, a guy named Bernard Shiel, announced at a meeting of the CIO of unions. Here he is with John L. Lewis, the head of the Congress of Industrial Organizations on the left there, where Bishop Shiel basically said he supported the integration of baseball. He was a major political and moral force, not only in Chicago, but around the country. And again, that helped. It also helped that Lester Rodney helped to recruit in 1939 a couple of major league players, particularly Red Rolfe, to do a column in the Daily Worker. And they always tried to get ball players who were not communists, but nevertheless to write stories for the Daily Worker. And because Lester Rodney had such a good relationship with so many ball players, that he was able to do that. Leo DeGroscher, I hope I can say this in public. Leo DeGroscher once said to Lester Rodney, "For a fucking communist, you sure know your baseball." So it was, they knew what they were talking about. Again, the CIO, I don't know why they called it a Negro group, because the CIO was a white and black organization of workers and unions. They demanded a meeting with Landis and the owners, and once again, in December 1942, they refused to meet with them. But Wendell Smith was a better organizer in some ways, and with the Pittsburgh Courier. And in December of 1943, he persuaded Landis to allow the owners and the publishers of the major black newspapers to meet with the owners of the 16 major league teams at the time at their annual meeting in Chicago. And this is a photograph outside that meeting of two of the sports writers on the left, Wendell Smith on the right, and there's Paul Robeson, the great artist, singer, activist, Broadway star, movie star, concert soloist. At the time, probably along with Joe Louis, the most well-known African-American in the United States and widely admired. This is before he got blacklisted during the McCarthy era. And he spoke at this meeting. They invited him to join the owners of the black newspapers. And he had been an All-American football player and a great baseball player at Rutgers University, among other things. And so he gave an impassioned 20-minute speech calling for the integration of Major League Baseball. And in doing so, he basically said, look, if I can play Othello on the stage, then baseball should be able to handle having black players. And so he made this statement. Prior to the meeting, Landis told the other owners to listen politely to Robeson and then don't ask any questions. And so Robeson gave his talk, and then and then nobody asked any questions, and he left. And the owners of the black newspapers spoke, expressing their outrage about Jim Crow in baseball, and nobody asked them any questions. And it was clearly a move to assuage the battle that was being waged for integration. So this was the story in the Pittsburgh Courier. It says, Judge Landis says no official race ban exists in the majors, but that wasn't a very optimistic statement because they knew that it wasn't going to happen without more pressure. But after the meeting was over, Philip Wrigley, the owner of the Chicago Cubs, who was also involved in starting the All-American Girls Baseball League of their own fame, he met separately with the owners and others, called the Citizens Committee for Negroes in Big Leagues, which included a lot of unions and civil rights groups. And he basically said that he supported it. But he said, and he basically told them that there's a gentleman's agreement that we never put in writing. And he said there are men, excuse me. He said there are men in high places who don't want to see integration. So he was kind of coming clean to these activists. But he again never put his money where his mouth is. He wasn't the leader. And so the same coalition of unions and civil rights groups and the black newspapers and others, they sent a telegram, a resolution to FDR saying that he should create a fair employment practices investigation of segregation in baseball. And again, just keeping the heat up, keeping it in the press, keeping people talking about it, getting people to to pay attention. Bill Veeck is an interesting story because he was a maverick in many ways. He was a socialist. He voted for Norman Thomas for president several times on the Socialist Party ticket. He eventually, as the owner of the Cleveland Indians, integrated the American League with Larry Doby in 1947. But if he had his way, according to Veeck in his autobiography, Veeck as in Wreck, he would have integrated baseball 4 years before Branch Rickey did. Now, this is a story that he tells in his autobiography, and there's been a big debate among baseball historians about how accurate it is, although Veeck's biographer believes that it's true, but I wanted to put that caveat in there. So according to Veeck, he learned that the Philadelphia Phillies had gone bankrupt and were for sale. And so he made a deal with the Phillies owner, a guy named Jerry Nugent, to buy the team with money from the CIO unions. He ran into John Carmichael, a sports writer for the Chicago Daily News, at the train station on his way to Philadelphia, to seal the deal. And he told Carmichael, according to Veeck, I'm going to Philadelphia, I'm going to buy the Phillies, and you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to put a whole black team on the field. That was what he says in his autobiography, Veeck is in Wreck. He believed that he could turn the Phillies into a winning team and make money at the same time and demonstrate that black players were equal. And he had a long history of civil rights activism, even when he owned the Milwaukee Brewers, the minor league team, and refused to abide by segregation during spring training in Florida. So he was definitely sincere about this. Whether this was a true story about the Phillies is another question. Anyway, so he goes to Philadelphia and to seal the deal, and learns when he gets there that he'd made one crucial mistake. He had called Commissioner Landis to tell him what he was going to do. And before he got off the train in Philadelphia, Landis had already arranged to sell the Phillies to another owner who wouldn't integrate. And so that never happened. But Veeck did, once he got a hold of the ownership of the Cleveland Indians, now the Guardians, a really stupid name, he did integrate with Larry Doby. He integrated spring training. He moved spring training. He was the first to move spring training to Arizona, which was by no means a bastion of racial justice, but was not officially segregated the way Florida towns were during spring training. So you got to give some credit to Bill Veeck. Happy Chandler, one of the most important turning points in the movement to integrate baseball was that Landis died in 1945, and the owners replaced him with a guy named Happy Chandler, who'd been both a senator and the governor of Kentucky. Now, knowing that, you would think he would have been a segregationist, as were most white Kentuckians at the time, and he probably was. But when a Pittsburgh Courier reporter named Rick Roberts interviewed Chandler and asked him his views about integration, he was shocked to hear Chandler say that he thought that players should be allowed to be hired by teams, quote, regardless of their origin or race. And so this was the first sign that when Landis died and there was a new commissioner, that maybe things would open up. And Chandler was open to the idea of integration. This was in 1945. And a couple of months later, Branch Rickey did sign Jackie Robinson. But to continue the story just for a few more minutes, in April 7th, 1945, Joe Bostic of the Harlem paper, The People's Voice, brought these two Negro League players, Terrace McDuffie and Dave Thomas, to Bear Mountain near West Point, where the Dodgers were holding their spring training without notice, and told Branch Rickey, insisted that Branch Rickey allow Leo DeRocher to try these two black players out. Now, unfortunately, although McDuffie had a reasonably good career in the Negro Leagues, by then he was in his mid-30s and he was way past his prime, and Dave Thomas was never that great a player. And so they weren't the caliber one would expect. It's not clear why Joe Bostic picked them, except they happened to be nearby. So they did get a tryout, and Bostic leaked the story to the New York Times the next day, and this was a story in the New York Times. 2 Negroes are tried out by the Dodgers, but they failed to impress President Rickey. But Rickey by then had already had plans to integrate baseball, because he had a few weeks later he signed Jackie Robinson, although he didn't go public with it until October. But he wanted to do it on his own timetable, and he wanted to get credit for it. And he didn't like being pressured by radicals and black newspapers and unions and the press. And so he was really angry that not only that this happened, excuse me, but that it got into the New York Times. But it kind of forced his hand to sign Jackie Robinson sooner than he wanted to. Same thing happened in Boston. Isidore Muchnick was this left-wing, progressive Jewish city council member in Boston. And he told Tom Yawkey and Joe Cronin, who was the general manager in 1945, that unless they gave tryouts to black players, he would make sure that the city government withdrew the Red Sox permits to play baseball on Sunday, which was the biggest day for attendance. And so that forced Joe Cronin to give tryouts to 3 star players in the Negro Leagues, Jackie Robinson, Marvin Williams, and Sam Jethro. And so they did get a tryout. Once again, Jackie Robinson who at the time was with the Kansas City Monarchs. He performed really well. He later became very close friends with Muchnick. But as the Pittsburgh Courier reported, they were left standing by. That they never heard from the Red Sox again. It was, even though Hugh Duffy, the batting coach for the Red Sox, said that Jackie Robinson would have been a great addition to the team, nothing happened. So the result of all this, of course, is that the Red Sox, who were owned by Tom Yawkey, probably the most racist of all the owners, they didn't integrate until 1959 with Ponce Green. They were the last team to integrate. They could have been the first team to integrate, but including with Sam Jethro, but they didn't. I'm not going to go into detail about this, but there are a lot of left-wing progressive politicians, including Phil LaGuardia, the mayor of New York, Ben Davis, a member of the city council of New York and a member of the Communist Party, and Vito Marcantonio, a left-wing congressman from New York, from Harlem, who were pushing for the integration of baseball, got the state legislature to pass a law calling for the integration of baseball. So there were always these political allies in cities around the country. It wasn't just people like Isidore Muchnick. And the fact that there were black players playing in the Mexican League made a big difference, because it was in the Mexican leagues that black players began to feel like they were being treated equally, got them even more angry about the segregation. They met white players, including some former major leaguers, who jumped to the Mexican League because they paid them 2 or 3 times what they were getting in the major leagues. And so that helped to break the barriers as well, having integrated teams of white, black, and Latin American players playing first-class baseball. That made the players and the quality of play in the Negro League, in the Mexican League, was really fantastic. My final story is about a guy named Sam Nahum, who grew up in Brooklyn in a Jewish Syrian family. Arabic was his first language. He was a star football player and baseball player at Brooklyn College in the early 1930s. Casey Stengel hired him as a pitcher in the Brooklyn Dodger teams. He played the minors for a couple of years. He was brought up to the majors in 1938. He pitched a great game in his opening game. He came in second in the ERA one year. He was traded to the Cardinals, then he was traded to the Phillies. He was a so-so player. He doesn't deserve a lot of recognition as a player. What he does deserve recognition about, and there's a little-known story about it, is that during World War II, he wanted to join. He was Jewish. He wanted to fight to beat Hitler. And so it took him a while before they sent him overseas. While he was stationed in New York at an Air Force base, he played, exhibition games and beat major league teams. And he played a lot of Negro League teams at the time in the exhibitions. And so he eventually went overseas in 1943 in a little town called Oissy, France. After the Germans surrendered in 1945, the military started expanding baseball teams on every military base in Europe, and they held a contest, a World Series. And so they asked Nahum, who'd been a major leaguer, to organize the team in this little town in France on his base, and he did. And his team, which is pictured on the right, was there's Sam Nahum on the top, the fourth guy from the left. He was also a communist, and he believed in integration. So even though the teams on the military bases during World War II were all segregated, Sam Nahum insisted. It's not clear who he insisted to, but he hired or recruited 2 star players for the Negro Leagues in order to guarantee that they'd have a better team, but also as a matter of principle. One was Willard Brown, you see them at the lower right. The other was Leon Day, who pitched for the New York Eagles. To make a long story short, they beat General Patton's team for the military World Series championship in September of 1945. Patton had rigged the team so that there were 7 or 8 major leaguers on his team called the Red Circlers. The only major leaguers on Nahum's team were him and a guy named Bowers, who played for the Pirates for 2 years. But they beat Ewell Blackwell, who pitched in 3 games in the World Series, and they beat them 5-4 in the final game. The final game and 2 other games of the military World Series were played in Nuremberg Stadium in Germany, which was the site of Hitler's big speeches. So here is a Jewish communist pitcher recruiting 2 Black American players from the Negro Leagues, beating an all-star team of major leaguers in the Military World Series in 1945, played in Nuremberg Stadium. By then, however, they had gotten the German prisoners of war to build a baseball field inside Nuremberg Stadium, and they changed the name of the stadium to Soldiers Field. And you can see that it was big news. This was an article in the Sporting News with Nahum's picture on it. And there's a story on the right in the New York Times. And so, and this happened in September of 1945. Now, Jackie Robinson had been signed by Branch Rickey in April of that year, but they didn't announce publicly that he had been signed until October, a month later. So, I don't know for sure that this victory of an integrated team in the Military World Series influenced Branch Rickey at all. There are a lot of things influencing to go public and to do this, but clearly it helped to, they would get 50,000 people at these games in Europe for baseball. So a lot of American soldiers saw an integrated team for the first time by watching this Military World Series. And then, of course, Jackie Robinson understood that although he was a great athlete and Branch Rickey was a great humanitarian and a great shrewd baseball operative, that he wouldn't have made the major leagues without this movement that took place that began while he was still in middle school in Pasadena. And he repaid that debt many, many times through his involvement in the civil rights movement. And I don't have to go into that except to say that there's never been in the history of professional sports any professional athlete who was more engaged in movements for social and economic and racial justice than Jackie Robinson. He put his life on the line. He put his bank account on the line. And he died early, in part because at age 53, in part because of all the pressure he'd been under for many years. But he walked the walk when it came to fighting for social and racial justice. And he also understood that he wouldn't have gotten there without people who came before him. That's the story of the baseball civil rights movement before Jackie Robinson. So thank you. I'd be happy to take any questions or comments.
Thank you, Peter. Wonderful presentation. And I'm still trying to drum up questions, but you're stuck with a couple from me, I suppose, to start things off. On July 5th of 1930, Colonel Rupert opened up Yankee Stadium to help support a union, A. Philip Randolph's Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters.
Yeah.
Do you have any insight on that event, either on the field or off the field, that you could share?
You know what? I don't. I'm fairly familiar with the history of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, and I wrote a book about 10 years ago called "The 100 Greatest Americans of the 20th Century: A Social Justice Hall of Fame." And A. Philip Randolph was one of the people that I profiled, but I don't know about that story in the Yankee Stadium. Except here's one possibility. Now that I think about it, one of the teams that played in Yankee Stadium was the New York Black Yankees. They rented the field, and Jake Rupert and the Yankee owner made a lot of money, as did other major league owners, in renting out their teams to the Negro League teams. And one of the owners of the New York Black Yankees was Bill Robinson, known as Bojangles, the great dancer and performer. So it's who was also a supporter of civil rights, even though people called him an Uncle Tom. He was definitely a supporter of civil rights. So it's possible that Bill Bojangles Robinson intervened on behalf of A. Philip Randolph and the Black Union, who were the porters on the sleeping car trains, and asked him to allow them to use the stadium. It's also possible, and we might want to look that up. There might have been a game that day of the Black Yankees in the Negro Leagues, in which case it wouldn't be surprising. For example, Effa Manley, who owned the Newark Eagles, was also active in the civil rights movement and used her stadium and her presence as a big advocate for civil rights in New Jersey and New York. So now that I think about it, since you've asked that question, my first instinct would be to say that it was during a game of the New York Black Yankees owned by Robinson, by Bojangles Robinson, and that might have been the venue where they held the fundraiser. But this is all what I'd say an educated guess.
All right. Well, thank you for that. Alan Saul offers a comment, and as I did, he says, thanks for a tremendous presentation. And he says it was nice to open with Cato, and he also enjoyed your introduction of Press Box Red. I think that's Lester Rodney.
Yeah, Lester Rodney was called Press Box Red in the biography of him. Yeah.
So I just wanted to pass that point on from him. And I'm going to, as long as I have the mic, let me try another question.
Okay.
You mentioned Octavius Cato as a possible Hall of Famer. Are there any others, black or white, in the integration of baseball story that you feel could also get such recognition?
Yeah, there are a lot of them. And I think that even Fleet Walker. So there's a big question. I assume some of the people in the audience here are SABR members, as am I. There's a big question about what are the qualifications to get into the Hall of Fame. If you're a player, there's certain thresholds, but they vary from year to year. And if you're an owner, an executive, it's who your friends are. Lots of third-rate owners, as well as Commissioner Bowie Kuhn, who was like a complete incompetent as the commissioner. His friends on the Hall of Fame board of directors got him elected to the Hall of Fame. Meanwhile, they kept Marvin Miller out of the Hall of Fame for 30 years on the grounds that he didn't deserve it because he wasn't a player and he wasn't an owner. And, you know, it was basically anti-unionism. And fortunately, it took a long time, but fortunately, after his death, that's another unfortunate thing, the Hall of Fame did induct Marvin Miller to the Hall of Fame last year. So my candidate for Hall of Fame is, not surprisingly, Curt Flood, who was a civil rights activist early in his career, who was invited by Jackie Robinson to go down to Mississippi to speak at civil rights rallies when he was still a young player and didn't have the stature of being an all-star superstar. And he did that out of conscience. And also out of conscience, he sacrificed his career for other players who would come later by challenging the reserve clause. Excuse me. And, you know, he was an 8-time All-Star. He was a, he was a 4-time All-Star, an 8-time Gold Glove winner. He was the co-captain of 2 pennant-winning Cardinals teams. So as a player, you know, he is sort of on the borderline of getting into the Hall of Fame. But as a human being, as a public figure, as an activist, as somebody who made a major change to baseball, even though he didn't win his 1970 suit against Major League Baseball to overturn the reserve clause, he set it in motion. And Jackie Robinson was one of the 3 players who testified on his behalf at his federal trial. And so the others were Jim Brosnan and Hank Greenberg, a former player. And so they, you know, they understood that what Curt Flood was doing was revolutionary. And after that suit, he was blacklisted from baseball. His personal life took a spiraling down, and he suffered a lot during the last few years of his life. I interviewed his wife, Judy, a widow, Judy, who told me about their first date. And she was a member of the Screen Actors Guild. She was a famous actress. And he kept asking her on the first date about, is it really true you can have agents if you're an actor? Is it really true you have a union? Is it really true that, this is in the early 60s, is it really true that you can leave your studio and go to another studio? In other words, he was pumping her with questions that were on his mind that later became the basis of his lawsuit against the iron grip that major league teams had on their players, a form of indentured servitude, he felt. And he called himself a well-paid slave. So I know I'm giving a sermon here, maybe to the converted, but I think there's no doubt in my mind that the most important person missing in the Hall of Fame right now is Curt Flood. And it is sort of outrageous that Cap Anson, the instigator of Jim Crow in baseball, has a plaque there, but Curt Flood doesn't.
Okay, here's one more from me, and Sean is telling us we only have 5 minutes left, so I'm looking for more questions. Do you think things would have been different if, let's just say, after the 1942 Negro League World Series, the Kansas City Monarchs were invited as a whole team to join the American League and the Homestead Grays were admitted to the National League? Any reaction to that possibility?
There is a play about which I wrote an article in a book that somebody else edited last year called Mr. Rickey Calls a Meeting.
Yes.
It's not true, but it's based a little bit on truth. And it's a meeting of Bojangles. Branch Rickey calls a meeting at a hotel, a secret meeting, and he invites Bojangles Robinson, the owner of the Black Yankees and the highest paid entertainer in black entertainer in America, and Joe Louis and Paul Robeson. And he says, you're the three most powerful and well-known and respected figures in Black America and in New York. I need your support before I agree to integrate baseball with Jackie Robinson. And Jackie Robinson's in the room. Joe Louis and Bojangles Robinson basically, sure, you have our support. And Paul Robeson, the radical, says, you know, if you integrate Major League Baseball, Negro League Baseball within a few years is going to disappear, which is what happened. And all these jobs for players in the Negro Leagues are going to disappear, and there'll be a handful of them in the major leagues, but all these, and the people that work in the stadiums and all that kind of stuff. So he said, I'll agree to it if you agree to put an all-black team to get your fellow owners to get an all-black team in the major leagues. And Branch Rickey said that he couldn't do that because he didn't have the power to do that. I don't know, and I doubt that Paul Robeson ever actually said that, but it definitely conforms to what he might have said if he was put in that situation. So this is not a totally crazy idea. So if the Monarchs and what was the other team you wanted?
The Homestead Grays.
The Homestead Grays, yeah. Were played in the major leagues. At the time, they would have had to deal with going to St. Louis and Cincinnati and even Philadelphia. There would have been a lot of fights over segregation, but it would have been a fight worth fighting. And it would have exposed black players to white baseball fans, some of whom would have obviously fought it the way white people fought school busing. But many others would have been exposed and been thrilled to see the style of baseball played by the black players in the Negro Leagues. And so I think it would have hastened the rest of baseball to integrate, but it's such a, it's such a foreign idea in the terms of what people were talking about at the time. If the story in Bill Veck's autobiography is true, and he was going to buy the Phillies and either put some black players on the team or put all black players on the team, it's not exactly clear what he meant to do, if the story is true. That would have had a big impact as well. But, these are all what ifs, what ifs.
Well, you did a great job with my 3 what ifs. And I guess Sean's going to come back here now and close this down. But I very much appreciated your presentation and your answers.
Great. I had a lot of fun.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. Again, great presentation, as Ted mentioned. Ted, thanks for the questions and everybody else for your comments. As we wrap up, we're getting everybody for next month, which will be our last one for the year. We have Jim Overmeyer. He's going to do, the topic is going to be the life of Posey. That's going to be December 17th of next month. You can go ahead and register for that one now. I'm looking for a great presentation for Jim as we wrap up the 2022 season of series number 2. And again, as I mentioned, if anybody's interested in joining the panelists for next year, please contact myself, Tom Kern, or Ted Noor. Again, Peter, thanks again. Peter and Ted, stay on. For everybody else, enjoy the rest of your day wherever you're at. Stay warm. Hopefully you have no snow. I know Peter's nice and warm on the West Coast, but that's on the East Coast here. Stay warm. And happy Thanksgiving to everyone, and we will see you next month. Bye. Okay, everybody's gone. I'm gonna stop the recording.